Through the Noise with your host, Ernesto Glucksmann.
And we're on. Thanks for coming on the show again. This time we're not in a studio, unfortunately.
What can we do?
We're doing it through Zoom. That's okay. I'm glad to see you again, man. I'm glad to, reconnect and see where the journey's been with you. But I think a little while ago, I kind of, you're a financial advisor. Jason Howell Company. You're one of the partners. You're a family wealth advisor. Full disclosure, anybody listening, I have hired you to help me get some of the basics in order, and that was very helpful. So so we know.
4 or 5 years ago. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
And I'm gonna have to tap you back in again to
Good.
recheck me. So
Good.
but you have worked in the financial services for a while. You have several lettered acronyms. One recent one that you just got. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Just yesterday. So it'll take a day or two before they go through the permutations to add it. But, the most important thing is there are opportunities to learn in an organized fashion and to make sure you've actually learned it through the examinations.
All right.
So I appreciate them.
Hot off the presses, this SRI. So like on your website, you're a sustainable, responsible impact approach. Like you and your partner, you're looking for to help guide people that are interested in SRI,
Yes.
this concept of ESG and so forth. And so I'm super excited to have you on the show because that's been the direction I've been pushing and shifting our show to understand that world a little bit better. And so today I feel like we're all going to learn a few things of where things are and where they need to be. So
Sure.
give us, just for those that are not that familiar with ESG, can you give us like the shiny, sales pitch of the concept of the measuring stick?
Well, I'll begin this way. There's a hierarchy of the acronyms that we hear. SRI, ESG, impact. What do all those phrases mean? Can they be used interchangeably? We hear media professionals use them interchangeably. We hear financial professionals use them interchangeably. That makes it hard and it makes it confusing. So if you just happen to be confused, you're actually in good company because many intelligent people are confused. I did some work in actually getting formal education in the area. So yeah, a few of the letters after my name, the Chartered SRI Counselor, the CSRIC, was on purpose so that I could be not only ahead of my peers, but ahead of I guess the train it would take, train is the bad metaphor, but the time it would take to get up to speed on what all this information is. Before I tell you the definition that came out of that learning, I'll
Okay.
just start with the idea that, the one phrase that we may have heard before is like socially responsible investing. You heard that phrase? If you have, then that makes sense because that was kind of the first phraseology or the first kind of phraseology that was out there way back before us. In the auspices of religion and Judaism and Islam and Christianity, this idea of socially responsible was from a time when our religion really defined what was socially acceptable. And that's where you get the beginning of the myths about the current status of what we call SRI. Oh, it's socially responsible investing. Well, who gets to decide what's socially responsible? Who gets to decide what my morals are? I'm not about that. Well, it's not that anymore. That is where it came from centuries ago. The more recent I can speak to is in the 18th century with the Quakers. And as far as where they kind of came into it and from it, on this particular land, they in 1725 or so decided they didn't want to be involved with the slave trade, with any organizations that were participating in the slave trade. So that was a watershed moment for their organization, their religion, because it wasn't just turnkey. That wasn't what they began with. Understand, most people on this land were using slaves as part of their economy, and so that was a very big moment in the mid 1700s for the Quakers to make that decision. But that was, in a sense, socially, you could call it responsible. You could call it sustainable, because it really isn't sustainable to enslave people. So, that's sort of the earliest on this continent. Maybe you could say that we had that kind of thinking. But to jump to your question, what is the formal explanation? I'll just read it, what I had for and from that program, the CSRIC. And their definition, I quote, is any investment strategy that seeks to maximize financial return while simultaneously advancing an idea, belief, or philanthropic cause that is important to the individual investor with the hope of changing the world for the better.
Okay.
It sounds beautiful to me, right? I reworded that a little bit, and I just call it this: an advanced form of investing that incorporates additional data to increase an investor's realization of revenue. And if you simplify it that way, it actually is much more akin to what is actually happening, especially in the United States.
Okay. Wow. So this is a long history, and then into the recent years, we're sort of the industry's figuring out, okay, how do we actually define it down to the specifics, as far as you can get specifics, right? Because philanthropic values, that varies between person to person, right? So how does that play into the concept of ESG that I keep hearing, the sort of environmental, social, and governance designation and ratings?
Well, understand that, so I just gave you SRI, and it is no longer socially responsible investing. That is not the denotative definition of SRI anymore, but it'll always get juxtaposed because that's how it began, and it's the same letters.
Okay.
And so sustainable, responsible investing or impact investing is essentially how it's defined now for that acronym.
Okay.
Now underneath that is ESG. So we know ESG acronym, environmental, social, governance. It is the underlying factor in all SRI strategies. And so sustainable, responsible investing, that's an umbrella phrase. ESG now is how you apply that. And there are 5 ways to apply that. We are very familiar with a couple of them, but we're less familiar with what's actually being used by the people who are using these factors to make decisions around investments.
Okay. Can you walk us through how that breaks down further then?
Sure. So the number one, maybe number 1 and 2 theme or way we understand this is, for example, sustainability, right? We understand sustainability, the E's for environmental, makes sense to me. Whatever we can do for organizations that are supporting different energy sources, different energy uses, maybe less fossil fuel, be kind to the earth. We know about that. That's what the E has stood for, and that's what it's about. So that's number 1. It's the most popular on the surface. And so that's what many people think, and especially many financial advisors who are not involved, they think that's what all ESG is, and that is not the case. The second one, and this is even more specific to the industry that I am a part of, it's this idea of, I'm going to get rid of the bad actors, right?
Okay.
I don't like, if it's a fossil fuel company, I don't like them. So they're not part of my fund. If it's tobacco, if it's alcohol, if it's pornography, all of that's out. That harkens back to that socially responsible ethos, that religious ethos, right?
Okay.
Only the people that make me go to church are going to tell me not to drink, right? So not to smoke cigarettes, like, oh, it's bad, right? So we know about that. And I think you came to the table here with that in your mind, as most people do. Who's to say that drinking or smoking is bad? It's my issue, not yours. I don't want that messing in my investing. Maybe that's the case, but we're only on number 2 of 5.
Okay.
Number 3 is positive screening. And so it's saying, Bob's company over there has diversified his board, and he's added women to the board, which has been really helpful to have that diverse perspective. And by the way, a great program internally where they're promoting people of all stripes and colors. And so that blends kind of the social and the governance. And it says, that's a firm I want to have as part of my portfolio. And I want to have it for a couple of reasons. Number 1, I feel like that's a good thing. To me, that just makes ethical sense. Number two, I've seen some numbers that show that having more women on corporate boards actually comes out arithmetically, numerically, in performance to be a good thing. And so I'm good with it for a couple of different reasons. That's positive screening. That's number three. We don't hear a lot about that. The fourth one, though, is the biggest way that the upwards of close to 17, 18 trillion dollars of American funds have a screen for. And so there's a universe of investing that's done just in this country. There's also, of course, a universe of investing in the rest of the world. There are different ways out of these five that folks actually make adjudication. Remember, I said my definition was just additional data to make investment decisions. We use data in accounting, generally accepted accounting principles. We decide, oh, this person has this much revenue. They have this much sort of, bills that they owe. They have this much cash. I think it's a good company to invest in. Well, that's data, financial data points. But there are ESG data points that we can layer on top of that, that are an enhanced way of looking at different firms. Of the, again, at 2018, it was 16 trillion. It's up towards 17, 18 trillion in 2020 of all the investing in the United States of America. So about 1/3 of all investing has an ESG integration applied to it. So what does that mean? It means I don't screen out bad companies. Who decides who's bad? I don't bring in good companies. Who decides who's good? No, I do the same analysis I would do, whether it's fundamental analysis, technical analysis, tactical asset allocation, strategic asset allocation, whatever you want to do, efficient market theory. I do all of that with my current investing. And then I say, you know what? There is that thing that's coming out that maybe more women on boards is a good thing. Let me look to another screen on these 50 companies I'm investing in and see who makes the cut. I know, by the way, I want to make another screen on risk parity here because most firms are not including climate risk in their footnotes to their financial statements. I used to be in accounting. It used to be if you had an issue that was coming up on the horizon, and you didn't have it currently in your numbers, you had a fiduciary responsibility to put in your footnotes. It would typically be, for example, some court case, like the company is being sued. So it could have been like Philip Morris being sued. It could be Coca-Cola being sued for something. Oh, it doesn't show up in their numbers, but footnotes to the financial statements.
Right. These
We
are
are being
potential
sued.
risks and we know about it, so we have to disclose it. So I'll put it in real fine
Exactly.
print at the bottom here of this little report, but it's
Exactly.
there if you do your homework. Okay.
Exactly.
The
At least it
climate
was
risk.
there. And so why are we not putting in accounting for, to be more professional, climate risk? We know we're seeing changes. The changes are undeniable. The causes are debatable, but the changes are undeniable. Well, you are seeing that in professional circles. If you run a property and casualty insurance company, you are incorporating climate risk. It's a real thing for you. If you are in other parts of the world, you are forcing companies to incorporate climate risk. It's a real thing and it's not politicized there. But here in our country, we haven't quite gotten to the point to require incorporating climate risk. Though if you listen closely to our Federal Reserve chair and that whole group, they are talking about this idea of superimposing, of requiring for them on what they're looking at, or at least accounting for it in their presentations, climate risk, because it's not fake. It is actually happening. And so if I am an investor for a pension fund or an endowment, or of course for clients, I might look at, and I pick single securities. I might say it's really terrific that I'm doing this particular asset allocation, that I'm doing tactical analysis, or I'm doing efficient market theory. But if I'm actually a proper investor, and I know if I'm a professional and I know there's something that should be in the footnotes, but for some reason the Securities Exchange Commission doesn't require it, it's just an enhancement to my clients that I actually look at it and say, yeah, this company here that's maybe an insurance company that I have as part of the portfolio, what are their numbers that they're incorporating for climate risk? Ooh, you're not even accounting for it at all. So the fact that you have all these pretty numbers, but you make a no accounting and no preparation for it is pretty scary. But this firm over here, they are thinking about it and they're already investing in it, and their profits are less because they're doing R&D. But if I'm a long-term investor, which all my clients are, I'm concerned about the long term, and I reward a firm that says they're looking at the long term. So I'm happy that they're spending money in that way. That is called ESG integration. I didn't screen negative screens. That was number 2. I didn't do positive screens. I brought you in because you were cute and I thought you were Birkenstocks. No, I looked at the entire universe of companies. I applied my normal financial performance screens that most people don't understand, but they approve of. And then I applied this other screen because it takes into account risk. And risk has always been a part of what I help to deflect and reduce for my clients. That's number 4. The last one, which to me was a watershed moment and getting my firm, Jason Howell Company, totally change in how we view our investment style, was corporate engagement. And this could be for many people a watershed moment for them. Have you ever gotten a proxy from your company that you're invested in, a proxy vote thing?
Yeah.
And what do you typically do with it?
To be honest, I just say, well, I don't really own enough shares to make a difference, and I don't have time because I got to do a million other things, and I don't know the names on this, so I'm like, okay, somebody else vote on that.
Right. I'll just sort of toss it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we, especially if they send you a whole like prospectus or, a whole annual report, you're like,
and
do you
really
think I'm going to read this?
They don't really, they're sort of like,
It's so much.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, to be fair, I did the same thing. And then I learned about shareholder activism, and it blew my mind, and I'm still learning about it. And it's this idea that the Securities Exchange Commission actually gave small investors an opportunity to engage corporations at a level that would get their attention. All right, so picture this.
Okay.
Picture it's your wedding. And just imagine for a moment that you have your wedding anniversary every year, and every year you invite those 200 people, 150 people, whatever it was, to come and celebrate the fact that, you were married to this great person. And it's awesome. Much like your first wedding, you have your best man comes and speaks, does a toast, says something a little awkward, but it's funny. We laugh and it's great. And the maid of honor does the same thing and it's great. And then the parents get up there and they say, son of a gun, you're doing a great job with my daughter. And you've been a, great, new daughter for me. All these things are happening and being said, and it's wonderful. And then you eat the food and you eat the cake and you dance, and it's a great night. But imagine if you also were required to invite your ex-girlfriend, your ex-boyfriend every year. And in fact, when you sent out your invitations, your ex-girlfriend and ex-boyfriend got the same list, the mailing list that you have, and they got to send out a note to all of them too. And that Ernesto, there was this one time, and that's why we broke up. And not only did they send that invitation out to everybody, they came to the wedding and each anniversary, and they get a chance to speak at the mic. And they say, I know that you decided to stay married, but guy was a jerk. Total jerk.
Anyway, here.
That's my time. I'm done. Every year. Well, exchange the wedding and the anniversary parties for the corporate shareholder meeting.
Okay.
All right. And every time you get one of those proxy votes, you have an opportunity to also send a message out to everyone. And here were the requirements up till last year. Okay? Up till last year. So since 1934, I should say up till the end of this year, because the changes don't go into effect until the beginning of 2022. So from 1934 through the end of this year, these were the rules from Section 14A8 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. An investor who holds at least, listen to this number, $2,000 worth of company stock, that's 10 shares of Microsoft, and the investor that's held the stock for the minimum of 1 year prior to the filing deadline filing to basically make a grievance, that investor has an opportunity to say something at the annual meeting, to send a notice out to everybody else, to say, here's something that I would like you to vote on, to be a part of this. Such a small number. Now that number got increased a little, the time got increased. You still have to have $2,000, but instead of holding it for 1 year, it's got to be 3 years. And you need a larger amount if you'd like to go under 3 years. And then there's some new accommodations that have to be made in regards to having people present at the shareholder meeting or being able to do it virtually, which would be a lot easier because who among us has time to actually go to the shareholder meeting? And so there's this idea, the way I view it, you can now, you can go and vote in November for the president that you like or don't like, right? Vote against the one you don't like, vote for the one you like. And then you sit in January and February and March and April, and you're like, I hope that was effective, right? But we know where the money is. We know in the last campaign, I think they spent upwards of $2 billion to run a campaign. I mean, that's a heck of a lot of money for politics when we knew both the people. They have websites.
Okay.
What if we were able to repurpose that money in shareholder activism? Well, it's actually not necessarily drawing from campaign money, but it is actually happening. There are organizations that call together small investors like you and I, and they say, what's the issue? And when it comes to ESG factoring and integration, they're able to get to the tune of typically 30% or more votes from the rest of the stockholders, Oh yeah, those mean-spirited capitalists or what have you. No, 30% of the time they're able to get agreement. I should put it a different way because I'm misusing my statements. They receive 30% support. So it's this idea that me, small stockholder, put something out there and said, I think that firm should be carbon neutral. Let's put it out for a vote. At least 30% or more of your peers actually agree.
Oh, okay. So what you're saying in my brain is still catching up to all of this information. Thanks, Jason, that you're giving me. But what you're saying is it's not a whole lot of money to put into a company and then to potentially go or hopefully zoom in and make an appeal to the rest of the rich guys owning shares at this company.
Yeah.
To say, hey, this company hasn't done anything about climate change and I'm worried about the risk here.
Yeah.
And you guys should too, given that you guys hold so much more of the shares anyway. Maybe we should do something. And so you're saying that it looks like that kind of, activism is gaining 30% support traction.
Plus, it's very rare that, so you ask yourself, what if we got 51%, would they have to change? No, it's not how it works. But 30 to 40% is significant enough. And here's what actually happens on the ground. You as an investor put something out like that. 30% of people say we're into it too. Guess what you get? That the people outside the building with the picket signs, the people shouting at the executives just going to work, guess what you get? You get a hearing with the executive team. That's how it was positioned to me by a person that I met who runs an organization that does nothing but shareholder activism.
Okay.
They call all these folks
where all this was coming from.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous amount of leverage that one individual can get in there with.
Well, just consider the fact you don't get to speak to operations per se, but you do get to speak to these other areas. And this being one of them, these ideas in and around the way that they do business. And so whether someone has a diverse board is not operations per se, so you get to speak to that. Whether or not someone is dumping in the river is not operations per se, it kind of is, but you can speak to that. So there are all these issues, and there are plenty of organizations, mature organizations that have been around for not for a couple of years, decades, that have been calling together this activism. And if you think of a firm like Exxon and do an internet search on Exxon and activism and the changes they are making today because of the activism that's happening, then you will see the power of ESG. The fifth element here, which is shareholder activism, out of the five. So we spend so much time debating, oh, environmental, I don't know if that actually has performance and blah. Oh, I don't know about negative companies. Who decides what's negative? I drive my car. I like my fossil fuel. That is such a small part of what all of this is. And in fact, it's only 2 out of 5. So it's the minority. And what's happening to the tune of trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars, 16, 17, 18, 19 trillion dollars, a third of our investing, a third of it is already pointed towards this. So when people say this is nascent, that it's novel like the coronavirus, that it's new, when I just gave you a history that goes back centuries, then it's a little bit, it's just humorous because they haven't done any research.
It's new to them.
You've been following headlines.
New to them, new to just new people.
Exactly. And this is specifically why when, in June of last year, which is amazing how long ago it's almost a year ago, sitting in the midst of the pandemic in my house, 3 months in, now I'm like, I don't know, 14, 15 months in my house. And then post George Floyd, and just thinking as a financial firm, what can I do? And realizing I had heard these things and it popped into my mind. What is this thing with, I don't know, ESG, SRI impact? Like, I know that's a thing. Let me actually respond to those, emails that are coming to me that I didn't ask for. Let me contact the vendors that are trying to sell me something, apparently. Let me have a conversation with fellow financial advisors who've been in this space for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and see what they're about and what they're talking about. And when I expressed an interest to like joining them, which to me sounded like competition, you know what they said? Welcome. Happy to have you on, if you ever saw Casablanca and at the end of the movie when he's like, welcome back to the fight, very akin to that. They welcomed me. They were happy to have questions answered. They were happy to have one more advisor out of 300,000 actually understand that this isn't new. This isn't a joke. This is real. This has been happening. There are fund families, Calvert funds, Parnassus funds, PACs that have been in this since the 70s at least. And why do we mark the 70s? Because that was apartheid, South Africa. And at that time, people were saying, I don't want to invest in any company that's supporting that. Can you get me out of that? And they began, that would be more of your socially responsible, right? That would be your negative screen, number 2. Historically, that's why we remember it. What else do we remember historically? If you've done any surface level of this, you remember, oh, is there a performance problem? Well, right, because around apartheid, when that was a big deal and people started saying, I'm going to do socially responsible investing. And they said, well, I don't like smoking and people die all the time. And we're finally figuring that out. Then I don't want to invest in Philip Morris. Well, Philip Morris had the biggest dividend in the world at the time. And they were the most profitable company. Exxon, the most profitable company up through 2011 or 12 in the world. And so if you eliminated those, negative screen, number 2 out of 5, then yeah, you're going to lose performance. Absolutely. If you're doing negative screening or socially responsible investing. But that is not all of this. That is 2 out of the 5 in ESG. Go down the list and say, I'm going to include firms, that number 3, that I think make sense. I'm going to take all firms and I'm going to screen for good governance. I'm going to screen for risk. I'm going to screen for how they treat their employees. Do you think that matters for profitability? Some people do. If you're a long-term investor, do you think that it's long-term good to treat employees poorly or long-term bad? Up to you. But for me and my money, I think I know what I want to support for the long term, not because it's nice, but because it's necessary for performance.
Wow. Okay. This is on different levels here for me, because kind of just realizing how small of a threshold can get you as the seat of a board of a publicly traded company. that alone should probably awaken anybody who has something, that feeling of like, I want to do something with my money, right? Well, there, you just you just opened the door that exists, that's been existing, that's been happening. Because that's the other part I was been wondering, like, well, who's been, there's been changes in the marketplace. There's, corporations have been adjusting what they're saying, doubling down on sustainability, on diversity, inclusion. They're just, and I was just wondering, like, aren't these entities just driven by their financial gains only? Who is driving some of this? And you could say, well, some of it is customers are changing their appetites. Okay, yeah, you could say that, but this sounds like there's even a bigger, a better, I don't know how to describe an analogy, but a fulcrum and a point
Yeah.
that people are getting into, and then they're creating, and then they're appealing again to everybody's, that kind of the risk, how exposed are we as an organization? We're not even disclosing that, right?
Yeah,
Perhaps.
there's different areas of it, and it's
Hmm,
exciting because
that's
this
interesting.
is where I feel positive and have always felt positive about capitalism. There's a certain purity in capitalism when coupled with democracy, and they're not the same thing. So with capitalism, it's about success and business and whatever else. Well, what is success and business? Success in business, if anyone has ever thought to start a business and didn't because they weren't sure, or did and they were successful, they know that business succeeds when you solve a problem. Solve $1 million problem, make $1 million. Solve $1 billion problem, make $1 billion. How many of your friends have Amazon Prime? If it's all of them, then there's a reason that someone's a billionaire. Now, there's also some negative things that have come out of that firm, but the positive things that were done worked. And they worked really well because there were problems that were solved for literally millions of people in this country. And so that's how capitalism works. There's some negative, there's some positive, and that's the situation. And then there's all of this money because value is rewarded. And what excites me about learning about this area is there's an opportunity now to repurpose the benefits and to make definitive decisions to say, I don't have to lose money to do good. And in fact, we all know instinctively that the more people that are successful in a spending economy like the United States is the more people that are going to spend. And if I create value in my company, then they'll spend on my company. So I know I'll make sure that they're better off and I'll make more profits. Right. Like it's the purity, the part of capitalism that's good, that is actually suspended and taken care of and undergirded by this in the two ways that you mentioned. On the one hand, you can be bitter and just say instinctively, I don't believe in short-termism, what my numbers are every quarter, which is hard because many outlets, CNBC, Wall Street
Mm,
Journal, they all look at you every quarter.
right.
But I believe in long-termism because my investors are looking at this for the long term. So I want to make sure that I have a sustainable business. It's called a going concern, another accounting phrase, for a long time, which means it needs to grow and compete. And this is the way I grow and compete. So you can do that and not even be nice about it. At the same time, you have a few stakeholders in your company. You have employees, you have customers, and oh, yes, you have investors. And some of them are well-rounded people, and some of them understand and see their peers, their siblings, whatever else, and they realize, I appreciate what's happening here, but I'm going to voice my opinion when I don't think it's something isn't right as well, as many people did post George Floyd, for example, as many people have been doing post the Georgia election or the Georgia election law changes. We're seeing that. And who's speaking? Yeah, it's consumers to some degree, but who cares about them? All they're going to do is get a picket sign and march around. Who cares? But please don't let it be my investors.
Hmm.
Please
Don't
don't let that come up at my wedding.
don't be an influence on my investors at my
Yes, because
wedding.
if you influence my investors and if all those people knew that $2,000 in now 3 years would get them a seat at the table, they do it differently. That to me, as you said, it is that watershed moment to know that you have an opportunity to influence where the power is. It's not with politicians anymore. You know that. We all kind of know that. Where is it? It's with the money, the $2 billion spent on a presidential campaign on two people whose names we knew very well. One who's been in politics for almost 50 years and one who's been in business for almost 50 years. We knew who they were. And yet we spent all that money for what? Name recognition? Or where was that money coming from? In large part, unfortunately, thanks to Citizens United, it's coming a lot from corporate dollars. Well, let's change the paradigm. Let's continue to fight that. If we can reverse Citizens United, then rock on. But at the same time, let's play the same game. Let's work with the corporations and let's vote our dollars in our proxy statements. Let's tell others how to do that.
Oh man,
and let's change it from that end.
Jason, I'm never gonna throw out a proxy statement now. No,
I bet you're not.
I'm gonna. Can we just shift just slight gears? Because this is sort of like you just gave us like a corporate life hack or something here. Is what I feel like just happened. But I also want to understand just a little bit more on just the ratings of this stuff, because I'm what is it? MSCI?
Yeah, MSCI.
They collect a lot of the data to report and grade these companies so that the funds that are screening for certain characteristics of their funds or whatever they're promoting their funds to be about, the values of the fund, they're using these gathered ratings. But when I kind of dug in there, one of the questions I wanted to ask is, how much of that data that's collected is A, self-reported, and B, compelled by some regulatory public or thing? And
Sure.
how much do they check the actual data accuracy, right?
A very good question, the right question to ask, and exactly the button that every one of your listeners needs to press, and press hard. And the good news is, before I answer your question directly, is that button is being presented by the current administration. They have come in to the presidency, into the White House, and essentially said, support me and I will support you on this. And so, yes, in our country, all of the data that is reported voluntarily. You know, again, I keep mentioning it. I come from accounting. I never thought I would care about accounting again. But, you know, what if all of these companies, these Fortune 500 companies, let's just say the Fortune 500 companies exclusively that many people invest in, what if the Fortune 500 companies got to self-report their financials? Well, what do you mean? They self-report them all the time. Yeah, they're required to send their financials up. And by the way, they are required to organize those financials according to generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. They've been required to do that for a very long time.
So that we can compare the financial reports between everything.
How do we know the difference between Tesla and Toyota's numbers? How do we make an adjudication there unless at least the accounting standards are good? We know Tesla says they're an information company, not a car company. They're a tech company. Oh, don't compare us to the rest. Okay, you say that. I hear that, much like I hear ESG and SRI, and I hear that. But come on, I'm an investor now. I'm not messing around. This is my family. How can I really compare this? You look at the accounting records and you make an adjudication. You say you're not a car company. How much are you investing in other stuff besides cars? If I don't see the math, then I don't see the math. Like, you make a decision based on that. It's real. The Securities and Exchange Commission has requirements. And if you don't fall through the requirements, you have to get audited, and then audits come out and that messes up your numbers. And oh, there's risk. My financial advisor understands if you have a negative opinion on your financial records that there's risk, and now he knows to pull out of that. Well, terrific.
The Enron example back in the
the Enron example, exactly. Obviously, people have tried to skirt those rules, and we punish those companies ferociously when we catch them. But no one is in any particular position to either punish, but this is not about punishment, at the very least view comparable figures, comparable data from one organization to the other. How do I know the difference between what Exxon is doing and Chevron is doing? It not if I'm doing number 2 screening out, but if I'm working down my list and I'm doing ESG factoring and I'm trying to see between these two oil companies, because I happen to want an energy company and fossil fuels in my portfolio because we'll be using oil for the next 100 years, no matter what happens, at least some percentage. How do I know which one to do? Well, number one, I can look at the accounting financials and make an adjudication and do my technical analysis. That's fundamental analysis. Or I could look at what Chevron has done versus Exxon in the world of, switching over to
Transitioning the glide path, as some of them have
exactly. I
mentioned
could do that
too.
if I had the data. Oh, wait, I do have some data. They self-reported. How do I compare it? I don't really know because there's no standard. So the Securities Exchange Commission
Okay.
did actually want in the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, this was in there. It just was never enforced, never reinforced. The idea of actually having standardized reporting. And so that's an easy one for your listeners to say, hey, we would like standardized reporting. It's not asking companies to do anything, nothing, but please standardize the reporting on the individuals. If I'm worried about the full spectrum of ESG, I want to know how you treat your employees. I want to know the diversity that you have in your firm. I want to know what happens to diversity as you move up the chain. I want to know, are you using child labor? I want to know, are you getting your products and your service, is your chain, your supply chain going through countries that I don't appreciate, supporting countries I don't appreciate? I want to know all these things. I want to know what kind of risk I have with your CEO. What kind of things are they saying, are they doing that I should know about? I mean, you could have standards around there. We have some standards that are actually already available from the United Nations as one organization. There are the Sustainable Development Goals, which
Right.
many people have heard of. Those aren't actual standards. Those are things that we're trying to fix. But if I scroll through what I'm looking at here, the Principles of Responsible Investment, if you go to unpri.org, you will see a set of principles that came underneath the sustainable goals to say, here are the principles that we think matter worldwide. And these are the things effectively that we can measure, unpri.org. And some countries have hemmed some of what they have done to those standards. We have not. But these are essentially the new generally accepted standards. There is SASB, Sustainable Accepted Standards Board, and they have standards as well that we could hem to and say, let's at the very least, all we're asking, because we are sophisticated investors, tell us what's going on, share the data. I'm not going to say you can't do this, can't do that. Oh, I'm not going to impose upon your capitalism and your free will and all that. I am just going to be regulatory about this. And I'm sorry, we do have rules within capitalism. That's the democracy part. Democracy and capitalism have to work together, or you just have the strong over the weak.
Right. So I had, in preparing for the our discussion here,
Sure.
the Security Exchange recently in February, I think, created a climate and ESG task force with about 22 enforcement folks to start looking at, which is weird because it's 2021. Like they just started that. Like
No.
to
Yeah.
start because there's clearly a lot of quote unquote greenwashing of the companies or the efforts, or we've carbon offset our footprint by X numbers, but it doesn't sound like there's standards. And people, of course, when there's no referee and you can kind of make the rules up to then sort of show how great you are at the game.
Right. Right. Ever play a game with a 4-year-old?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's the rule? Oh, okay.
I didn't know. Didn't know it's just changing on the fly.
Right.
So effectively, I mean, if there hasn't been much, kind of even just if there's no standard here, then that's the challenge that we should be asking corporations to at least explain how they're coming up with this stuff, right?
Well, they are explaining it to some degree. Larry Fink,
Okay.
CEO of BlackRock, the largest, fund family in the world, he has been out there this year. Every year he writes a letter to his, to his stakeholders. So one letter to clients, one letter to everybody else. They're both posted publicly. Anyone can do an internet search and do Larry Fink letter, and you'll find it. And it's good reading, and it's miraculous reading in some ways. Here is this incredibly successful capitalist who gets it at this point. However, you have heard criticism of BlackRock, even from his former CIO. Criticism from BlackRock. So what did you hear in this year's letter? And I say here because he also goes on CNBC and other networks to actually speak to his letter. He says we need to do better. He literally says it. What more can you ask someone in position to say? Admit the fact that you need to do better. He is passionate about this. And here's the key thing that he said this year, after the letter came out, to all the rest of his peers on CNBC. He said, peers, this is happening. Either we do it as business people or we wait for government to make us do it.
Right. And that's another compelling pressure here, because if there are companies that are 100% committed to reducing their impacts on climate, which is a big concern for me on the show, like that's one of the values we're trying to get involved with, right? Then they're going to be investing heavily, but then their competitors are claiming some of the same things without the actual same rigorous standards or investment. That's not going to fly well too long, right?
No.
We're going to have to find somebody to then independently verify this stuff. And so it's just a kind of a matter of time as to A, who does it, if the industry can do it for themselves, or B, eventually the government might come in. And then those regulations are never going to be, easier. They're going to be a lot hard, right? That's the stick that government wields, right? If you guys don't get it together, Mr. Association Group, of whoever type of businesses, that you're not going to like when we come in, because it'll be a big hammer approach, not
well, it's oversight.
Yeah.
And nobody, I mean, we haven't wanted oversight since we've been like 16, right? Who wants oversight? And so you hear this from people like, I don't want government, blah, 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 blah.
Accountability,
like, right?
it's hard.
you're an adolescent. I get it. Like you hit puberty, like good for you. I don't want it either. I mean, let's not be nonsensical. Who wants it? But we do want clean water. We do want clean air. We do want people not to take advantage of our peers, of our
and we want my
siblings.
investment in your company to be reasonably assured that you are taking the risks of climate change around your whatever enterprise, whatever
Sure.
multinational, that you're thinking about it, and then you're bringing it to the table, and then you're taking action around reducing its risk, right? We're talking, I mean, go back. If you're going to appeal to anything beyond just simple dollars, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is.
I mean, who was the insurance company that had to bail out everybody in Texas earlier this year? Right?
Ooh.
Who was that? Because whatever insurance company it was, it cost them a lot of money. Whoever that homeowner's insurance firm was. And what about the insurance companies that insured the different technologies that Texas had in place for their grid? Whoever that was probably is going to pay a pretty penny. If those insurance companies were a part of your portfolio, wouldn't you like to have known what they did on measurements to decide whether or not the business was going well? The fact that they did or did not require people to do maintenance on some of those pieces of equipment. Wouldn't you like to know that? This is akin to the Equifax breach we had some years ago, where Equifax, no one thinks of them as a company to bring in because they do clean energy, or a company to kick out because they do fossil fuels and they don't wear Birkenstocks. No one thinks of that company that way. But we had a discussion before where we talked about they were rated poorly, different data, not included in financial statements, different data called by one of the organizations that you mentioned, MSCI. MSCI is just one of many organizations. Bloomberg is in this business. There's organizations that many people have never heard of: Corporate Knights, International Shareholder Services, Rep Risk, Sustainalytics, and on. Thomson Reuters. There's plenty of organizations that pull data together. And one of those organizations looked at this and said, you know what? Before the breach, we score them a 0 out of 10 on cybersecurity.
Ooh.
Now you could be a firm. It used to be you could be a firm. You could say, oh, if I'm a grocery store, I don't care about that. Well, actually, you care about that because there have been breaches for grocery stores and Target and everything else. So now cybersecurity is a real thing. What is cybersecurity referencing? Risk. Not in the financial statements. So if I'm Mr. or Mrs. ESG, I'm including that risk. I want to know about that risk too, please. I want my financial advisor to know about that risk, because what happened less than a year later? They had a breach. Well, what do you think? A material issue that they did not have financial statements or comments about was going on. They got kicked out of the index that said these are the good companies, not because they were dumping in the river, not because they were running fossil fuels, but because they got a 0 out of 10 in this data point that is not required to be revealed. And so where I get very excited is the idea, and where I want your listeners to push that button that is being presented by this administration with that SEC task force and in other ways. I want you to push that button to require the data. Now, what that data is, well, go to the PRI and figure out what data they're looking at and what things they're hemming themselves to, what many financial firms and others have essentially signed and been signatories to PRI and said, we believe in this. Why? Why would they sign that? Because they believe in socialism? These are financial people that make money on top of money, on top of your money, on top of other people's money. This is about risk to the markets. And if you are invested in a company like Equifax, or you're invested not because you screen them out, a company like BP, wouldn't you like to have known what they've done for maintenance before they had the underwater problem?
You certainly would want the analysts to know those risks across all of the companies in that sector reporting on a similar.
At least look at the risk, but they can't even look at it. There's two ways they can't even look at it. They can't look at it if there's no data to look at. And they absolutely can't look at it if they're one of those financial advisors, investment advisors, financial folks that don't believe in it because they took a surface level approach and they said, yeah, that's a fledgling thing, SRI, ESGs. I mean, I drink, I want to, who can tell me? It's not even just about that. It can be about that. If that's your value, if that's your thing, there are people who focus on the religious part and say, this is what I believe, and I don't want to invest in entertainment and alcohol. That's fine. People can choose to invest however they want to. I'm happy to speak to that. But what I'm speaking to here on this, this call, this podcast, is the $16-17 trillion that professional investors who aren't kidding are looking at. And they're looking at risk, and they're looking at other factors that can create long-term value for their shareholders. It just happens to be aligned with long-term value for their stakeholders. And that's a good thing.
Man, I don't know what this conversation has done if you've revalidated my faith in capitalism, because this is a possibility that exists here, and that you don't have to be a multi-million-dollar investor to do some kind of hostile takeover to change the course of a company.
Right.
That you just simply are asking for the data, that it's probably there, it's probably collected, and the fact that somebody's simply asking for it in front of all the other investors, and they were like, oh shit, we didn't footnote that into this, or we haven't collected, or we do need more, or we really are greenwashing, whitewashing the risk, whatever you want to call it, washing.
Yeah,
that's a pretty powerful change. So that's what you're seeing. It's driving some of the substantive changes.
Yes, it's much more than people screaming and tweeting and just making snide comments. That's never really worked. Whatever huge issue you've been a part of, and again, this is why it dawned on me in June to look into this. When you think about the 60s and the Civil Rights Act and what happened and when it happened, it didn't happen because people were just like, just because they went out and protested generically. They protested for a Civil Rights Act. Like, it was for something. It's always been about, let's go in and do it the way it has to be done. And in a democracy, it includes our government. We have to press the buttons of our government to do the things that we think ethically are correct. That makes sense. And we have seen, and I have learned, that there's an opportunity when government seems to be run in large part by capitalism, which is not the way it's supposed to go. It just so happens that government put the mechanisms in for us as investors, and as you mentioned, not multimillionaire investors, just investors, to have a voice, to be able to move this, Titanic of an industry, of all the industries, and say, we do have a say. We'd like to say something. You just haven't said anything since 1934, many of us. We just haven't used it. But that shows the strength still in place in our democracy, in our particular government, that we have this. This is not universal. This is in our SEC law and regulation. And we can use this democracy to, as we have always done, to manage the capitalism and take as much of the best of it that we can, instead of sort of just deadpanning to the worst of it. There's great opportunity. It can work together, and inherently it is good for everyone, which is good for the corporations. They know sensibly that having more successful customers and clients is good for business. We just have to give them the opportunity to make that change. And that's happening very recently, as I said, with the Georgia voting laws that have been, put in place. You see the Coca-Colas, you see many others, you see the MLB going out there, and they're moving. They're not moving just because some people on Twitter were upset. Hopefully they're moving because morally they believe that this is what they should do. I also likely expect that many of their employees in this era of 2021 and change are saying things more vocally than they would have maybe in 2019. So that's pretty terrific. But there are also many people who are investors, and they recognize that this isn't right. And if this were put out on a shareholder vote, there would be a 30, 40, 50, 60% vote into the favor, which means it's going to your wedding, which means we have to talk about this sucks, everybody, and we haven't done anything about it. Okay, see you later. Appreciate it. This was all right. I'll get another drink. That's what they know. And so they're doing something now because they kind of need to.
Just to give you a chance to plug a bit the work that you're doing for your the families that you work with. This is wrapped into that, right? It's just sort of you're helping us get on top of our finances, do better, save for the future, etc., and invest in long term. But that there's also leverage that you're gaining if you choose to do this, if you choose to get involved, right? And this has excited you.
It has excited me for many reasons. I changed it. I put out a stakeholders letter every month. I have to write this month's, and that language was important. Again, this administration started focusing on language in our laws and the way we speak about people. No more illegal aliens, it's non-residents or what have you. And I think language is important too. I was putting on an economic summary every month, and it's like, well, who cares, right, about an economic summary? And I found the letter I was putting out was really changing to be more broad. And so we finally essentially rebranded it to this idea of, this is what our firm has always been about. It's been about all of the stakeholders. It's been mission-based. It's been purpose-based. When I left the Fortune 100 firm to start my own firm, that wasn't sort of a snap decision. I thought long and hard for actually a couple of years. I found out 9 months in that you could start your own firm. Didn't know you could do that. It's finances. I didn't know you could do that. But you can. Of course, that's how Morgan Stanley became Morgan Stanley, and Charles Schwab, which was a man, became Charles Schwab, right? And you can start your own financial firm too. I just didn't know I could. Well, over the course of 2 years before I resigned, I thought about the kind of firm I wanted to start. And what I wanted it to be was open, not just to millionaires, though we need millionaires to be able to succeed in these kinds of businesses, but I wanted to be able to open it up to others. And I wanted to take the best of what the multimillionaires are doing and bring it to all of the other folks that are clients and client families of mine. And one of those things was the idea of family governance, which is a focus on the values of the founders of the family, of the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the family. And that's the first section of my book, which is over here, Joy of Financial Planning, the 7 strategies for transforming your life and reclaiming your American dream. And the very first one is about family governance and what wealthy families have done over the centuries that other families do sort of iteratively and spontaneously, but unplanned. They actually get together as a family. They actually talk about the family finances, and they have to, right? Because they're going to be passing on a chunk of money. And they don't want it just to go to zero and go to nowhere. So they try to say, I'm not only going to pass along this money, I'm going to pass along my values. Well, since the firm began, very shortly after the early period, we started incorporating, and it was just me for a while, this idea of family governance. And now we work with all of our client families. We interview the parents, and we put together a family constitution that really speaks to their values. What's so neat about this kind of investing is we can add to this. We can say conceptually, these are our family values that we want to pass on, and here's our money. And now we can say definitively, here are the family values we want to pass on. Here's our money. And here's what we invest in to represent that. No, we don't invest in a company that's turning a blind eye to risk. No, we don't invest in a company that doesn't care about their human chain and they just take advantage of people. No, we don't invest in companies that work with child labor. No, yes, we do invest in companies that support XYZ. And oh, by the way, we do invest in companies that are fossil fuel because they're changing and they're one of the largest companies in the world. And they're starting to really highlight the alternative ways to do this. And the biggest companies that do it are going to make the biggest change. So yeah, we are investing that way. And all of these values that I've communicated to you, son, daughter, they're all reflected in our money. And by the way, we're still expecting performance. We're not idiots here. We're going to still hem to performance, but there are enough companies now, and there are enough tools, enough exchange traded funds and mutual funds to both look to performance and look to values, and now create stakeholder value.
Gut check. Last question, Jason. I think that's awesome, but gut check on this. Getting rigorous about investing in with your values, along with your values, and finding those companies that reflect that and are on board. Are they performing better than the companies that are just bottom line oriented or burn through their employees like it's no tomorrow, or it's all about simply just flipping whatever it is to make the biggest dollars?
Yeah, there are a number of myths about this kind of investing. And I mentioned early on the idea that as this became more widespread in this country in the 70s and 80s, there were specific reasons why there was underperformance, very specific reasons. As I mentioned, a couple of companies, the most profitable company in the world, Exxon. I mean, Exxon was a big deal then. Where did Exxon come from? Does anybody know who was Mr. Exxon?
No.
Exxon came from Standard Oil. Do you remember Standard Oil? Who was the robber baron for Standard
Rockefellers?
Rockefellers, yeah. 7 generations in, they are still an incredibly successful family. Do you know why they are so successful? Why David Rockefeller, 7th generation Rockefeller, says one of the reasons they are so successful when interviewed about his family governance that they still do? One of the reasons is because of the Sherman Act, which was the reason that Standard Oil was broken up, and it was the reason we have antitrust laws, the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act came specifically for Standard Oil, and the reason we have antitrust laws is because all the terrible things that the family did back then to make Standard Oil the number one. He was one of the robber barons of the early 20th century, the 1900s. And so it was very obvious that there were bad things happening. And so all these many years later, we have Exxon Mobil, that as of maybe about 10 years ago was still one of the most profitable, if not the most profitable company in the world. And so if you divested from Exxon, then you lost money because a profitable company makes profit. What we saw in 2020 was that was not the case. In 2020, we're very postmodern, right? So oil companies aren't the biggest and most successful, and no one was driving last year. So demand was down and supply was unfortunately up. So that was horrible if you had an oil company. People already know that smoking is terrible. They kind of knew it, and they sort of knew it more, and they knew it more and more and more and more and more. People are thinking smoking is terrible. So again, that's not where your number one companies typically are anymore. And what was terrific last year? Well, all of these tech companies, because we were all home. And so if you invested in an exclusionary way, number 2, then yes, performance was absolutely there. You crushed it last year, but that's an anomaly, right? That's what the mature, objective people would say.
The COVID situation, right?
Yeah, the pandemic situation, once every 100 years, hopefully no more often than that.
Right. This show, I've had a few people on that talk about this pandemic as the shot across the bow, which I keep referencing. we just learn a big, wonderful lesson of how ill prepared we really are. But it it can happen again, and it can happen soon, and they're anticipating it'll happen more frequently. So,
And then that's my anticipation too. Once you've sort of let the I don't know, the what out of the what, then
the
you're
nightmares, right?
yeah, starts to keep happening. But let me
Yeah.
speak directly to your
Okay.
question about performance in
Okay.
an objective way, in an academic way.
Okay.
And so in 2015, the Journal of Sustainable Finance and Investment, I'm reading now, published a meta-analysis that was comprised of more than 2,000 empirical studies, more than 2,000. That can be traced back to when? Of course, the 1970s. Why the 1970s? Apartheid, right? 90% of the study results showed that prudent sustainability practices, not socially, right? Because we learned it's a new word. The S doesn't stand for social anymore. Sustainable. 90% of study results showed that prudent sustainability practices have either a positive or neutral influence on investment performance. 88% of study results found that companies with robust sustainability practices and policies demonstrated better performance in their corporate operations as well as corporate cash flows. Oh, so now we're getting fancy, talking financial talk, right? So what do you glean from that? Here's what you can glean from that. It's a 2015 study. It did compile over 2,000 different experiments. It's very good. There's more work to be done. But I heard positive and I heard neutral. Okay. Now I'm a financial advisor. I've done a lot of academic study, a lot of academic rigor. I know about fundamental analysis. That's one kind of analysis if you're an investor. I know about technical analysis. I know about tactical asset allocation, dynamic asset allocation. I know about strategic asset allocation. I know about goals-based investing. All of these different types. If you could tell me that one of those types had the best performance all the time, terrific, then what I'd say to you is, I'm going to do it. And if that were the case, the other 300,000 financial advisors would all do that one type. They wouldn't spend any time on the efficient market theory that was, won a Nobel Peace Prize. They wouldn't spend any time there. They wouldn't look at adaptive markets theory. They wouldn't look at anything else. They just do that one type. So here is the canard in the question. Why does your analysis and anything I look at says that this kind of investing doesn't outperform all the time? I heard some people say it outperformed. That was 2020. I've heard 2,000 empirical studies say it's kind of neutral or outperform. So the jury's out, right? The jury's out. So it can't be that. Right. The jury's out on every single analysis that we do. There is not one economic theory that's actually proven to work all the time. Not one. If there were one, we would just do that. So now ask yourself why you're asking the question. Why are you asking the question whether it outperforms? We don't have enough money. We don't have enough performance. We don't have enough ways to figure out performance. Why are you avoiding the question of whether this is an important screen or not? Why? That's the turnaround question I have for anyone that asks. Because as I see it, and as certainly as the $16, $17 trillion is invested, they're not looking to say, I don't like you, so let's do this. They're looking to succeed in the long term. And to the extent it actually does affect things positively, wonderful. To the extent it does nothing, wonderful. If I can invest my clients in a portfolio that does look to diversity because it's ethically, maybe morally important, that does do less damage to the planet because it's, I don't know, survivally important, that does do better things with other people's resources and other people's humans, your sister, my brother, my parents, the way they treat and way they support child labor or don't support child labor, child slavery, human trafficking. If I can invest in firms that do the good to all that stuff and get the same performance, didn't I win?
Yeah, it's just sometimes I think it's like old habits are hard to shake out of your brain.
No. It's not old habits. No. It is not. It is uninformed,
Okay.
because there's a old understanding from the 1970s and early 80s that you lose. You just asked me about that. The new understanding, not based on one guy or one gal, 2,000 studies and counting, from not 20 years ago, from 6 years ago, not in Life magazine, which isn't around anymore, or People, or In Touch magazine, in the journal, a financial journal, actually said through all of these studies that actually there seems to be, because these things have to go on for 100 years, some improved performance generically, or nothing. I'll take nothing or improved performance over doing nothing with everything else. And I'm
All things being the
the
same. Yeah.
not the only advocate. Go to the CFA Institute website, the people that manage your parents' pensions, your school's endowments. There are 100, almost 200,000 chartered financial analysts. This is the work they do that you and I, and that includes me, don't want to do, to look at investing. And they invest the big dollars, lots of zeros. They are looking at ESG, not because it's nice, because it's necessary to maintain the pension, the endowment, the institutional money that works with different, not only associations, but also different unions and the like. I looked at this, and it was part of my study for the CSRIC, and it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of people have the attention. So while we're bandying about and parsing the myths with each other, the people who do this professionally are
They're
beyond.
already got it. Awesome. Thank you, Jason, for that lesson.
You're welcome.
that, yeah. All right, man. It sounds like we have a lot of work to do. So can't
Listen,
wait for that first proxy to come in. I am getting a paperless one, so I'm gonna go check that out on my Fidelity account, see what's up there.
do that. And by the way, for anyone that is either listening or watching, the answer to this is obviously to get more education.
Yeah.
So there is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. Every 2 years, they put out a new report. That's why I know the numbers for 2018 and 2020, because it came from their site. And by the way, we're not the only country that has a SIF, a Sustainable Investing Forum. There's the Euro SIF. Japan has a forum. So again, this is not child's play. It's not amateur. It's not new. But if you want the real education around this stuff to begin that process, they have something for individual investors. It's free. It's USSIF, so two S's in there, USSIF.org.
Okay.
And you'll look for resources. You'll find something for individual investors, of course. It takes about a half an hour, and you get some nice basics right away. And it's just you're so much ahead with just a little bit of knowledge. You're so far ahead of your peers. It's surprising, but it's what they say: knowledge is power, knowledge is truth. Education is the way you move along. It's absolutely the case, and it is no different in this area. Educate yourselves some, in the same way that was the response I had to friends of mine who said, post George Floyd, tell me about this thing called racism. What was been your experience? The answer is just get educated first, and that's your opportunity. And it's the same in this area of environmental, social, governance type investing. Get educated on this before you speak, and you'll have an opportunity potentially to change the world.
Awesome. Let's send it on there. I'll add that link to the show notes. Jason, God, thank you. Once
welcome.
again, we need to do this more frequently. So
I'd love it.
One question I want to just throw up there. If I'm just looking at it, happen to look at a stock, where do you look? Where do you go to get that rating that gives you some sense of what's being evaluated on that?
Well, I gave you a few earlier, and there are a number of places that you can go. So MSCI, you had mentioned that's a place. There are free sites that do some of the screening. There's a company called As You Sow, asyousow.org. And I believe you can do free screening on there. I should know that for certain. I'm pretty sure you can. And it just gives you the data. It gives you their rating. There are about 10 or so rating agencies, and the argument has been from other people in my industry, oh, they don't even agree more than 20 or 30% of the time. Yeah, of course. Why would they agree? There are no standards. And so some of them are using freely available information from the corporations, and they're asking the corporations to come and look at the data. Some of them are just pulling information from the news cycles. Some organizations are doing their own data screening, and they're looking at reports from NGOs and the like, and they're culling their own data. And so we have about 10 or 15 organizations that are getting data one way or another. And you have an opportunity as an individual investor to use any of these tools. Some of them are free, and get some information and then make some adjudication on where you'd like to invest your money. And as I say, don't feel hemmed to this idea of you're in or you're out. You know, you have the opportunity to be a little more sophisticated and pay some attention. Very similar to if you're invested in, you know, Nike or Reebok or something, and the stock went down today, you don't immediately sell because you have some vision about what they're going to do for the future. And so if it's a fossil fuel company and you want to invest, look at what they're doing long term. If you're looking at extra data, then you probably should someone who reads their annual report, because that's more data, and get a real feel for what this organization is doing with the investments that you're making in the secondary market on their behalf.
And then there's also investor relations at these companies that you can pick up the phone and call and just start asking them the questions. Just having the investor relations representative get a call that suddenly is asking them about, you know, one of these screening, you know, one of the 5 areas will be factored into, like, okay, we probably need to start thinking about how to respond to these things. Like, what is it? What's the data? Right. And then ask again, right? How do you know that your suppliers are, you know, carbon neutral, whatever it is that they give you an answer to, right?
Yeah, the new motto for the Washington Post since they got that new owner was democracy dies in darkness. There is an opportunity to leverage your democracy, not just by voting for politicians, by voting for and against the corporations that you support. As much as you vote with your dollars by being a consumer, you can vote as an investor. To you and I, that was a watershed moment that I didn't quite understand was a part of all of this. And yes, it will make a difference. You call your congressman, call your investor relations person.
That probably goes into ETFs and mutual funds too. Does that sort of play into that?
In a different way. And so there are mutual fund companies that partner with you effectively. So let's say you're investing in an organization that is part of Calvert Funds. Calvert Funds does a lot of this kind of activism, which is really fascinating. They're the ones that went back to apartheid in the 70s. It's on their website how much, you know, this is their thing. And so let's say you're interested in, you know, the environment and everything, all the accoutrement that goes into that, whether it's positive companies screening in or negative companies screening out. They are on the regular going and literally visiting with the Amazons of the world. So yeah, if you go, you're like, I don't like wearing ties. They're going, and they're not representing your $2,000. They are representing your $2,000, but when they go knock on the door and call investor relations, they're looking at millions and millions of dollars. And they say, we as a fund family would appreciate it if you had some plan to go carbon neutral. Would you be interested in doing that? They don't get the hand, they don't get the door. They get like, well, we are working on that, sir. This is very important to us. We're going to be doing this. And so what happens at that point is they say, okay, we don't have to go to your wedding. And that's exactly what happens. Like I said, most of the time you don't get 50% of this, like, oh, you have to do it because the investors voted. That's not what happens in the real world. And we want to be real here. What happens in the real world is there's that activity. They see that, and then they take a meeting. And they say, oh, well, we are working on it. When did you ever think that the executive team of Amazon would actually say to the activists, like, we actually are going to go carbon neutral by 2030 or whatever it is? Like, the reason they're saying these things is because of the activists. And it's not you and I. We don't have enough money. The fund families that include Amazon in their portfolio, they're going to them and saying, our individual investors are kind of like not liking it. Can you do? Yeah. And so you have fund families that you can be a part of as an individual investor instead of just buying an individual stock, which I wouldn't typically recommend to anybody who's looking at a long-term investment for their retirement, to just bet on individual securities. The risk is too high. There are funds and there are fund families that, fund families or the Vanguards, T. Rowe Prices, BlackRocks, all these other fund families that advocate on your behalf. Some of the trouble that BlackRock has gotten into, even Vanguard has gotten into, is that they have those funds they market. And that's where you get the chatter. They market them as green, as whatever else. But when it comes to, and this is the point, when it comes to voting proxies, they're nowhere to be found. That's why they get run up in articles and in opinion pieces by ex-executives. Not because, that nobody's doing this stuff. That's not what the detractors are saying. It's unfortunately some of the largest fund families are talking a game, but when it comes to voting, the stuff we never see, they're not supporting. And so some of these smaller fund families tend to be a place where really attuned investors go to get their value for their investment.
Right. The ones that are actually going to go vote are going to go in and go vote as a group and actually take the actions. Right. Well, that just means a couple more phone calls, right, with your investments.
Yep, it sure does. And so take a look at those opportunities. There are different ones. Nuveen has been in the game a long time. They're a subset of TIAA. Parnassus Investments is one that we've looked at. Calvert, I mentioned, there are a couple of, so iShares is BlackRock, and they are doing some stuff. And as Larry Fink has said, just as recently as this year, they're working to improve what they're doing, which has to be inclusive of the shareholder activism. So it's a very interesting time because we did have 2020, and many people similar to me got in and started learning more about this. You're going to see more financial advisors do this. Again, not because it's nice, but because it's necessary for long-term performance.
Awesome. Jason, thank you. Thanks. I mean, this is great. And you guys listening, thank you too. The few of you watching on the new YouTube channel, I appreciate if you guys click the like or something, whatever they say. I know that's
like and then subscribe. That's what they say.
And then Jason, your website, and you put out stuff on where do you put? Have you been putting out a podcast or working on? Yes.
Yeah, I've been dabbling somewhat. So I have a Zoominar that I might do every month and a half or so. I have one next week. That's going to be Wednesday at 3 p.m.
I'll get the episode up right away.
Thank you. Yeah. And I have people who come in and speak. I have got a lovely woman speaking who's part of a CDFI, which is, make sure I get this acronym correct, but it's a community development finance institution. And it's this idea that, you bank at one of maybe the 6 big banks. Everybody kind of banks at one of the 6 big banks. They're convenient, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, in 2021, we don't actually go to banks anymore, so we may not need the convenience. You could bank at a CDFI, which takes their profits and they reinvest it in communities that need support. And so here is a whole other topic that is still in the pocket of this sustainable, responsible investing. It is not ESG, but it is under this umbrella. This is more impact. And it's this idea of, I'm going to put my deposits in a bank, right, that isn't feeding, we all know the names of the largest banks because they don't need any more feeding from me, but maybe I put it into this quasi credit union. And credit unions used to be designed for communities, for memberships and the like. I mean, they still are, but this is a subset of a kind of a credit union where it's like we have a specific purpose. So I'm going to have one of the business development people on next week, Wednesday at 3 o'clock. So, go to my LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Jason Howell. More easily, just go to jasonhowell.com. That's where my website is. And I will be certainly sharing more of this information as over the next week. I have to. In fact, I got to work on some of the promo today.
Okay.
So, email me, jason@jasonhowell.com.
I'll let you go. Thank you so much. And thank you guys for listening. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.
For more episodes of Through the Noise, go to throughthenoise.us.